call the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Speaker, I rise to take a call on behalf of the Labour opposition in response to the Minister's second reading speech on the Taxation, Annual Rates, Trans-Tasman Savings Portability, Kiwisaver and Remedial Measures Bill 2009. Labour, sir, supports this bill. Sir, when members of the public are watching Parliament on television or listening to it on the radio, particularly if the main time that they listen to it is around question time or the Wednesday general debate, they sometimes go away thinking that the entire business of this House consists of calling each other names or attacking each other across the floor, and of course that's not true. And sir, it's on occasions such as this where we have a largely technical bill, one which makes needed improvements to our tax legislation and is not particularly partisan, a bill which was started under the previous Labour administration and continued by the same minister, it might be observed, in the current one. We see Parliament at its work in a select committee and in the House, making sure that the detail's up to snuff and that the bill will have the effect that it is intended to have. And there's been good cooperation in the Select Committee. I'd like to commend its chairman, Craig Foss, and members on both sides, on all sides, for a constructive approach which was taken to this legislation. On those process matters, sir, I would, however, observe one word of slight disappointment, and that is to hear today that the Minister has a substantive SOP around banks, covered bond programs and other matters to be introduced in the committee stage. And I do, sir, think it's a matter of some regret that material was not introduced and subject to the very useful and open select committee process that has previously ensued. And sir, were the justification for that step to be simply that taxpayers wanted it, there might be no manner of changes to the tax law which the Minister might propose. He might drop rates to zero, sir. The budget went part of the way there in some regards. He might get his head, sir, and go all the way. So there must be another reason for that. We won't prejudge it, sir, but I will record now that it is not good practice for this House to face substantive SOPs on the floor where it could have been avoided in a bipartisan process. So let me briefly touch on the summary of the bill's provisions. I want to raise a couple of specific matters and then to talk about the context for a minute or two. The bill introduces the following: the Trans-Tasman portability of retirement savings. That's the most important measure in the bill, in my view. It allows New Zealanders who have not opted out of Kiwisaver hitherto, but who move across the Tasman for family or employment reasons. It might be observed they won't be going for lower tax rates to Australia because tax rates in Australia are significantly higher than tax rates in New Zealand. But if they move across the Tasman, they can take their Kiwisaver savings with them rather than previously having to wait until they were 65 to collect. And of course that will be important to them if they are setting up a new home. However, sir, I do think this needs to be monitored. It is bipartisan, but we do need to monitor it because if there is a perverse effect such that the early release of substantial Kiwisaver funds acts as an incentive for people to move across the Tasman, we might find that it runs contrary to other objectives of the government, such as closing the gap with Australia or stopping the brain drain, although we're hearing less and less about those measures, sir, as the gap widens and more Kiwis leave. So the next point is that there are new rules for under 18-year-olds seeking to enrol in Kiwisaver, where the parents' or guardian's permission is required. Absolutely sensible, although we'd note that we strongly believe, and I'll expand on this later, strongly believe that Kiwisaver remains a very, very important step towards closing the country's yawning savings deficit and thereby assisting to reduce the current account deficit. The bill introduces flexibility in a provision applying to resident cooperative companies that require a member to hold shares in proportion to their trading stock transactions with the company, and as cooperatives, sir, become a broader and more important part of our economy, that flexibility is to be welcomed. There is the effective cancellation of beta account debits or branch equivalent tax account debits, and there is a 5-year tax exemption on profits for non-residents operating offshore rigs or seismic vessels in New Zealand. And I wouldn't be surprised if some member moves an amendment, provided that they don't spew oil all over our beaches, sir. Let's hope they do not. and we will of course hold the accountability instruments of the government to account in that regard. There's a number of new rules relating to binding rulings. Binding rulings are important, sir, but sometimes it's to be observed that the private sector, what might we say, uses a ruling for purposes beyond which they were originally intended, and one can think of certain large-scale banking transactions which have been reversed by the courts and by negotiation with our IRD, where allegedly there was an unfit purpose for which binding rulings were quoted. However, the changes in the bill are useful. There's an exemption for gift duty for gifts made to local or central government, donee organisations and distributions of property made in accordance with certain court orders, and we're pleased to admit Cure Kids to the list of charitable donee organisations. Sir, I want to touch on three broader themes which attach themselves to the bill. The first is around retirement savings, the second is on Kiwisaver, and the third is on anti-avoidance measures which relate to the provisions for LAQCs in clauses 20G and 20H on page 32 and 33 of the bill. Sir, firstly, retirement savings portability. As I've said before, Labor believes this is a sensible arrangement, the Minister's favourite word, and it's embodied here in the bill. It does allow more flexibility for New Zealanders. The chief policy risk is that there's a perverse effect whereby the flexibility around Kiwisaver deductions becomes somewhat greater, or it's easier to get your money out if you go across, not you sir, but if a New Zealander goes across the ditch to live in Aussie, they can take their Kiwisaver savings with them earlier than they might be able to access them in New Zealand. We'll just need to monitor that. I believe people will make their decisions about where they live for other and different reasons, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility that we may need to come back and look at that in the future. It's a positive step for current and future New Zealand superannuitants, and this government has, of course, however, ultimately undermined their future security by other measures, and sir, it would be remiss of me, notwithstanding the bipartisan nature of this legislation, to note again for this House that there has been a grievous broken promise in regard to superannuation, repeated once again in Budget 2010. So the single biggest decision, if you can call it that was made in regard to Budget 2009 was the decade of deferrals around the pre-funding of New Zealand superannuation. As members and listeners will recall, that pre-funding, the paying into the New Zealand Superannuation Fund of $2 or $3 billion a year to build up a fund about the size of the New Zealand economy, $160 billion, was there to support the baby boom as they moved through to superannuation. Otherwise, there wouldn't be enough tax revenue to pay their pension. By not pre-funding, sir, the government has put at risk the future of superannuation. There's no two ways about that. And in Budget 2010, sir, not only have they broken their promise to recommence pre-funding when the government's books are in surplus, that's now 2016, and the pre-funding doesn't supposedly resume until 2019, 3 years later. But even then, I note that in the fiscal risks section of the budget documents, that funding stream has been removed as, quote, no longer required. And I'm sure that grey power members will be extremely concerned to hear that. We are extremely concerned. We think it is irresponsible, sir, and I've made my point, I believe, on that. On Kiwisaver, likewise, sir, it is a matter of great regret that at a time when both the national government, the Labor opposition and members on the crossbenches are all remarkably agreed on the need to rebalance this economy in the wake of the global financial crisis and in the wake of the then exposed housing property bubble, and at a time when we all agree that the key ingredient to narrowing the financial deficit on our current account, which drives the whole kit and caboodle, is to improve our domestic savings rate, how silly it now seems that one of the first moves the incoming government made was to halve the incentives for ordinary Kiwis to participate in Kiwisaver, taking it from 4% to 2%. Sir, I think that is a measure that everybody in this House will come to regret. And Labor, sir, is pledging again today that not only will we restore Kiwisaver, but we will take it forward we believe it's a very, very important measure. And so my final point in